The announcement came without warning, delivered in the same flat tone the instructors used for every new decree of the interspecies survival course, as if nothing about it should have surprised anyone. Yet the moment the words left the instructor's mouth, a ripple of disbelief moved across the gathered cadets. The instructor, a tall reptilian veteran with frost scars etched along his jaw, lifted a metal slate and read the directive aloud. All thermal gear was to be confiscated immediately, including sleeping bags, insulated pads, compact heaters, and heat-reflective blankets. The night temperature on this planet dropped low enough to kill small animals in minutes, and every cadet knew it. The rule felt less like a challenge and more like a death sentence. Rowan stood among them, his hands resting casually behind his back, watching the others react. The alien cadets burst into frantic chatter, some shaking their heads vigorously, others clutching their issued gear as if expecting the instructors to pry it from their fingers by force. An avian cadet named Saraki fluffed her feathers nervously, trying to trap warm air between the layers. But even she knew it would never be enough once the night frost set in. A burly insectoid cadet clicked his mandibles, muttering that no one in his species slept below 10 degrees without a heating coil. Yet this was the planet where the instructors chose to forbid every familiar method of warmth. The instructor continued speaking, unfazed by the panic swelling through the ranks. He repeated the rule as if repetition made it more reasonable. Only natural materials could be used to endure the night. No synthetics, no metal-based thermal conduction, no chemical heating packs. The cadets would receive only a simple, thin piece of cloth traditionally provided for emergency bandaging. The directive sounded absurd, but the instructor explained it in the same tone someone might use to announce lunchtime. He pointed toward the forest edge, where a cold wind swept through the branches, rattling the leaves with a brittle, metallic sound. Whatever insulation the cadets built, it had to come from that place. Rowan exhaled slowly, feeling the cold already creeping in from the ground. He remained calm, not because he underestimated the danger, but because he understood challenges differently from the others. He had grown up on mountain trails where weather changed violently without warning. He had spent nights beneath half-frozen clouds with nothing but improvised shelter and dry leaves stuffed into worn jackets. Cold was not his friend, but it was familiar. He knew how unforgiving it could be, yet he also knew how to work with it rather than panic against it. The instructor ordered everyone to drop their thermal gear into the large crate placed at the center of the training ground. Cadets hesitated, clinging to their sleeping bags as if giving them up meant forfeiting their lives. Rowan stepped forward first, not out of eagerness but out of practicality. He unrolled his insulated sleeping bag, the one piece of gear everyone treasured, folded it neatly, and placed it into the crate. The instructor gave him a curt nod. Rowan did not return the gesture. He simply stepped aside, letting others follow. The alien cadets watched him, and something in his quiet acceptance made their resistance weaken. If a human could face this cold with nothing, they felt pressured to at least pretend it was possible. Eventually, the entire pile of surrendered gear looked like a small mountain of warmth that none of them would touch again until the trial ended. The crate snapped shut, metal locking into place, sealing everything inside. A wave of dread washed across the field as the cadets imagined what the night would feel like without any of it. Rowan stood silently, studying the tree line and thinking not about the cold, but about airflow, insulation layers, and how much time he had until the sun dipped low enough to start draining heat from the soil. Once the instructors finished explaining the rules, they dismissed the group to prepare however they could before nightfall. The alien cadets scattered immediately, moving in confused clusters, searching for anything that might offer comfort. Some attempted to gather dead grass, others pulled bark from trees, and a few tried to dig shallow pits, hoping to trap warm air close to the ground. Rowan watched them for a moment, noticing the same mistake repeated again and again. They thought in terms of surface solutions rather than internal ones. They focused on covering bodies with loose materials, but loose layers did little. Heat needed to stay confined. Without confinement, the cold devoured everything. Rowan walked toward the forest more slowly than the others, observing the environment the way someone might study an unsolved puzzle. The planet's forest had strange foliage, broad leaves shaped like starfish, thin fronds that curled inward when touched, clumps of moss with a surprisingly sticky texture. He knelt beside a patch of moss and pressed his fingers into it. The surface felt damp, but warmer than the air. It held heat longer than he expected. Interesting. He stored that detail mentally. A gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying a chill that made even Rowan tighten his jaw. The aliens whimpered or shuddered, but Rowan closed his eyes and let the cold bite him for a moment. He needed to understand the sensation fully before he could counter it. Cold seeped from the air, yes, but it also rose from the ground, radiating upward like a silent, invisible flood. Most of the cadets focused too much on the air temperature and forgot that sleeping on bare ground could be deadlier than the frost itself. He had seen it before on Earth. People feared winter storms but underestimated frozen soil. The ground killed quietly. Rowan opened his eyes and turned toward the instructor's platform. The reptilian officer stood watching the cadets with the calm patience of someone who had endured worse. Yet when the instructor's gaze briefly met Rowan's, something flickered there. Curiosity, maybe even anticipation. Rowan wondered if the instructor expected him to outperform everyone, or if the instructor simply waited to see whether humanity would live up to its improvisational reputation. Humans were infamous for solutions that came from nothing but stubbornness and instinct. Maybe this directive was designed exactly for that. As the sun began to sink, Rowan assessed the remaining daylight. He estimated 2 hours, 3 at most, before the cold became dangerous. The alien cadets still scrambled, panicking more with every minute, creating mounds of materials but no coherent shelters. Rowan inhaled deeply, committing himself mentally to what had to be done next. The forest offered all the tools he needed, but he would have to find the right combination: insulation, moisture management, compression, airflow control, and a way to trap his own body heat efficiently. That thin piece of cloth issued to each cadet was worthless alone, but with the right modifications, it could become something far more valuable. He would need pockets. He would need structure. He would need a way to keep leaves and fibers from shifting while he slept. Rowan stepped deeper into the trees, ready to begin collecting what he needed. The temperature had not even dropped yet, and already several cadets looked as if fear alone had drained their warmth. Rowan felt something different, an eagerness, a quiet confidence rising inside him. The challenge was brutal, but within it lay an opportunity to do what humans did best: turn adversity into invention. The instructors had banned sleeping bags, but no one had banned creativity. That rule, Rowan thought with a faint, determined smile, was the one thing keeping him from freezing. He disappeared into the forest shadows, the last rays of sunlight catching the edge of his issued cloth as he walked, ready to test whether the cold would break him or whether he would outthink it before it ever had the chance. Rowan moved deeper into the forest, leaving behind the panicked rustling of the other cadets. The air beneath the canopy felt colder than the clearing, a reminder that the sun was already slipping toward the horizon. He walked slowly, touching leaves, bark, and moss as he passed, trying to understand how each reacted to the dropping temperature. He knew he could not rely on guesses. The wrong material meant losing body heat faster, and losing body heat meant losing the night entirely. The forest had become his laboratory, and every step offered another clue. He started with the broad, star-shaped leaves he had noticed earlier. He plucked one carefully and pressed it between his palms. The leaf felt thick and waxy, almost rubber-like, suggesting it might be good at repelling moisture. He knew that moisture was the enemy in cold environments. Wet insulation was worse than none at all. He bent the leaf, checking its resilience. It flexed instead of cracking. That meant it would survive compression, which gave him the first hint that it might serve well as a layer inside his insulation pockets. He gathered a handful, not too many yet, as he wanted to compare them with others before committing. Next, he approached a fallen log blanketed with greenish-gold moss. The moss looked dense, almost spongy. He pressed his fingers into it again, paying closer attention this time. Beneath the surface, the moss felt warmer than the surrounding air, still clinging to the last traces of stored heat. He lifted a small clump. Tiny droplets clung to the underside, but the top remained dry. That told him what he needed to know. Used correctly, moss could act as an excellent thermal buffer. It retained warmth longer than plain leaves, especially when compressed. He searched for a patch that was drier than the first. After a short walk along the log, he found one growing closer to the exposed roots. He pressed it again. This patch, shaded less by fallen bark, held far less moisture. Good. He peeled several strips away and placed them carefully in the cloth he carried, forming a makeshift bundle. He made sure not to overload it. Weight mattered. If his cocoon grew too heavy, it would sink and press against the frozen ground, stealing warmth instead of preserving it. A flicker of movement caught his attention. A small forest mammal darting through a tangle of roots. Rowan crouched, observing the creature's nest. It had lined the hollow beneath the roots with a mixture of shredded bark, fibrous fronds, and fine hair-like strands from a plant Rowan had not yet examined. The nest construction intrigued him. Animals rarely chose materials by accident. He gently lifted a fragment of the fibrous plant, rolling it between his fingers. The strands felt exceptionally dry and formed an almost felt-like texture when pressed together. He rubbed them against his wrist. The fibers retained warmth almost instantly. This, he realized, could become the core of his insulation pockets, the layer closest to his body. He scanned the nearby plants until he found the source, tall, thin stalks topped with curled fronds that resembled miniature ferns. He pinched one and stripped the outer layer, revealing the fibrous interior. It separated into long, soft strands, perfect for trapping air. Rowan smiled faintly. Insulation was not about generating heat. It was about trapping the heat the body already created. Air was the key. The more air pockets he could maintain, the warmer his cocoon would become. He spent several minutes harvesting the fibers, moving carefully so as not to damage the delicate structure. Once he had enough to experiment with, he sat on a fallen branch and began testing combinations. He placed a layer of the broad leaves at the bottom, then added a mix of moss and fibers above them. When he pressed the mixture together between his hands, he felt the top layer warm from his skin. He waited to see how long it held the warmth before releasing it. The material cooled slowly, much slower than he expected. That was encouraging. However, he needed something for structure, something stiff enough to prevent the materials from shifting once inside the pockets he planned to sew into his cloth. He looked around, scanning for something lightweight yet supportive. His gaze fell upon a cluster of thin, reed-like plants near a shallow pool. The reeds bent gracefully in the wind without snapping. He approached them and bent one between his thumbs. It cracked cleanly when folded sharply, but when curved gently, it held its shape. Perfect. He cut a few pieces and tested them as frames. Without a frame, insulation slumped. With one, it held form. As he continued experimenting, the forest sounds began to change. Birds ceased calling. Leaves shifted differently in the breeze. Even insects quieted. These were signs he recognized, signs of an environment preparing for cold. He did not have much time left before the temperature dropped enough to make his breath crystallize. He gathered everything he had collected and carried it toward a large tree whose roots arched upward, creating a sheltered space beneath them. It would serve as a temporary workstation. Rowan laid his cloth flat on the ground and placed each material beside it in organized piles. He ran his thumb along the cloth's thin surface. It was meant for bandages, not insulation, but its weave was tight enough to hold small materials if he stitched pockets correctly. He pulled a thorn from the reed plants, testing its sharpness. It would work as a needle. For thread, he twisted the plant fibers from earlier, tightening them until they formed a strong cord. He began stitching small compartments into the cloth, each no larger than his hand, but arranged in rows so they could be filled evenly. His fingers moved steadily. He had done crude stitching before, repairs on jackets, tents, and makeshift tarps. This time, precision mattered more than appearance. Each pocket had to be sealed but not suffocating. If he trapped too much moisture or compressed the materials too tightly, his cocoon would lose effectiveness. As he worked, he kept glancing at the forest floor, noting the dew forming earlier than expected. The chill sharpened, brushing against his skin like a warning. He worked faster. Once the pockets were ready, he began filling them one by one. First, a layer of the broad leaves to create a moisture barrier, then moss for thermal mass, then the fibrous strands for air retention. He sealed each pocket with careful stitches, shaping the cloth into something heavier, warmer, and far more useful than its original purpose. Halfway through filling the pockets, he paused, noticing how the weight began to distribute across the cloth. He folded it over his arm to test the balance. It draped evenly. This was important. If the insulation hung too heavily on one side, it would pull away from his body during sleep, creating cold gaps. He adjusted one of the pockets, adding more moss until the cloth felt symmetrical. He continued gathering additional moss and fibers as needed, occasionally pausing to verify that each pocket retained warmth. He pressed his hand against the filled sections, waited a moment, and then lifted it. Warmth lingered. Good. The design worked. The forest darkened further, and the temperature fell quickly now. Rowan exhaled, watching a faint mist escape his lips. He had perhaps an hour before the cold reached its most dangerous point. The other cadets would soon feel it. He knew many of them were still scrambling without strategy, building loose nests that would bleed heat the moment they lay down. He could hear faint shivering already in the distance, drifting through the thinning twilight. But he stayed focused on his task. He tightened the final stitches and lifted the cloth again. It felt thick, almost like a heavy quilt, but flexible enough to wrap around his body. He placed it over his shoulders briefly. The materials reacted instantly to his heat, warming slightly as if awakening. He unfolded it again and inspected each seam. No loose stitches, no gaps, no shifting of materials inside. The cocoon was not complete yet. The shaping and sealing would come next, but the core concept was finished. He had taken raw forest materials and turned them into a thermal system designed to preserve his body heat through a night that could kill an unprotected cadet in minutes. He allowed himself a single brief nod of satisfaction. The forest hummed quietly around him, colder now, harsher. But Rowan felt something steadier inside himself, certainty. He had found the materials he needed. He had tested them. He had begun to shape them into a true survival tool. And the night, no matter how cold, would have to work harder than this to break him. Rowan remained beneath the arching roots of the tree as the forest dimmed into deep twilight, the shadows stretching long and thin across the ground. The temperature had dropped enough that the air stung when he inhaled, a sharp cold that scraped the inside of his throat. He unfolded the partially finished cloth and laid it out flat on the ground. The pockets he had already filled created a quilt-like texture across the surface, but to turn it into a usable cocoon, he needed to shape it into something he could wrap around himself fully. He also needed to add a closure system so that heat could not escape once he lay inside. He knelt beside the cloth and traced the edges with his fingertips, mapping out how the structure should fold. The cloth was rectangular, but a simple fold would not be enough. If he only wrapped it around his body, the pockets would shift as he moved in the night, creating cold channels and weak spots. He needed a way to anchor the edges, almost like stitching the material into a tube. But a tube was too restrictive. He needed an opening he could crawl into. He began marking points on the cloth with a sharpened stick, pressing small indentations into the weave, anchor points for stitching, folding lines, and the opening seam. As the last remnants of daylight dwindled, he lit no fire. The instructors had forbidden external heat, and even if he could make one, a fire would destroy the challenge entirely. Instead, he worked by feel, running his hands across the cloth to sense where seams should meet. He took one side of the cloth and began stitching it to the central panel, drawing the sides upward to create a curved shape. His makeshift needle, fashioned from a thorn, pierced the cloth with surprising ease, though he had to pull the plant fiber thread slowly to avoid snapping it. He stitched with deliberate tight loops, making each pass secure enough to hold under tension. He paused once the initial seam reached halfway up the cloth. He tested the curvature by lifting the edge and letting it fall naturally. The material draped into a half-cylinder shape, exactly as he wanted. This structure would allow him to lie within it while still retaining enough rigidity to keep the insulation materials close to his body. He repeated the same process on the opposite side, creating symmetry. His hands moved more quickly now. He could feel the urgency pushing him forward. The cold deepened every minute. Inside the forest, the wind carried new sounds. Somewhere in the distance, one of the alien cadets whimpered loudly, a tone filled with fear and discomfort. Shivering traveled through the stillness like a faint echo. Rowan heard it but did not let it distract him. He focused on the stitching, letting the rhythmic pull of the fiber thread guide his breathing. He knew the others were suffering, but he also knew he could not help anyone until his own cocoon was complete. Only then would he have the capacity to assist others. For now, survival required focus. Once both sides of the cloth were stitched, he inspected the seams by tugging them lightly, ensuring the cloth resisted without stretching. The structure looked crude, uneven in places where the thread tension varied slightly, but function mattered more than aesthetics. He folded the bottom edge inward, creating a rounded base that he reinforced with extra layers of moss-filled pockets. The bottom was the most vulnerable part. It would press directly against the frozen ground, and the ground would attempt to drain warmth from his core. He repeated the reinforcement on the lower seams, sealing every possible opening. Now he needed a closure system. He could not simply hold the opening shut during sleep. Exhaustion and instinct would loosen his grip, allowing heat to escape. He searched the ground for something he could use as a fastening mechanism and found the reed plants he had collected earlier. Their fibers, when stripped into narrow strands, were strong and flexible. He shaped them into loops, twisting them until they formed small rings. Then he stitched these rings along the inner edge of the cocoon's opening, spacing them evenly. Next, he braided a long cord from the same fibers. The cord would thread through the loops, allowing him to tighten the opening like a drawstring. He tested it gently. The braid slid smoothly through the loops, and when he pulled one end, the opening contracted in a neat line. This would allow him to seal himself inside while still leaving enough space at the top for controlled airflow. Airflow was critical. Total isolation would create condensation, and condensation would freeze. He needed balance. Once the drawstring system was complete, he turned his attention to the interior. He placed a thin layer of large leaves at the bottom, adjusting them to ensure no gaps formed between them. These leaves acted as a barrier between the moss and any moisture trapped inside the cocoon. Above them, he placed a thicker layer of the fibrous strands he had gathered. He pressed them down and felt them spring back slightly, confirming that they retained their elasticity. Elasticity meant they could trap air, and trapped air meant insulation. He tested the interior once more by placing his forearm inside the cocoon and waiting. The material responded immediately. His skin felt warmer within moments, not from external heat, but from his own body heat being reflected back to him. Good. That was exactly what he needed. The forest had grown almost completely silent now. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing the clearing. Rowan could feel the temperature plummeting sharply. He knew he had only minutes left before the cold reached a level where prolonged exposure could numb his fingers. He worked faster, making small adjustments, cutting loose threads, tightening certain stitches, checking every pocket for sagging or shifting material. He refused to leave anything incomplete. In this environment, mistakes were punished immediately. When he finally lifted the cocoon upright, it resembled a thick, leaf-filled husk, uneven but solid. He shook it gently to ensure nothing slid out of place. The materials held firmly. He set it down and prepared to test it properly. Before climbing in, he stretched his fingers and rubbed his palms together to generate a little warmth. He exhaled and then lowered himself into the cocoon, sliding his legs inside first. The interior embraced him with a surprising softness, and as he settled deeper into it, he felt the layers press comfortably against him. He pulled the upper flap over his chest and reached for the drawstring. With one pull, the opening narrowed, leaving only a small gap near his face. He exhaled through the gap, warming the small pocket of air around his head. The cocoon's shape held firm. The insulated layers cradled him. Even though the cold outside grew harsher, the interior felt noticeably warmer, as if the cocoon were alive and responding to him. He lay still for a moment, letting himself feel the reality of what he had built. The warmth was not instant, but it grew steadily as his body heat spread through the pocketed layers. He knew this prototype was not perfect yet. He would refine it further, reinforce certain seams, maybe add more insulation in the upper section. But for now, in this moment, he had succeeded in creating something functional enough to protect him through the freezing night. He opened the cocoon slightly and climbed out again. He could not sleep yet. There were improvements to make, and the night was only beginning. He ran his hand along the seams once more, nodding quietly to himself. The instructors had challenged him to survive without a sleeping bag, but he had created something far better, something tailored to the environment and shaped by instinct and improvisation. His prototype was no longer an idea. It was real, and it worked. He gathered more materials for reinforcement, ready to refine the design further. The cold would not wait, but neither would he. By the time Rowan finished reinforcing the upper seams of his cocoon, the forest had sunk into complete darkness, the kind of darkness that pressed inward from all directions. The last faint streaks of twilight had disappeared behind the jagged horizon, leaving only a cold, metallic glow cast by the distant moons. The temperature dropped so sharply that the air itself seemed to crackle. Rowan could feel the cold prickling through his clothes, creeping along his skin as if searching for any weakness it could exploit. He knew he had reached the threshold where preparation had to stop and execution had to begin. He positioned his cocoon under the arching roots that sheltered him, making sure the opening faced away from the wind. Every detail mattered now. A small mistake in orientation could allow a draft to cut through the warmth he fought so hard to create. He smoothed the interior one last time, adjusting the distribution of the moss and fibers, then eased himself inside. The cocoon enveloped him slowly, settling around him with a gentle compression that felt oddly reassuring. He pulled the drawstring until the opening narrowed to a single crescent-shaped gap near his face. Almost immediately, the cold tried to force its way in. The wind howled through the branches above, sending sharp bursts of frozen air across the ground. Rowan felt one of those gusts brush over the cocoon, and for a brief moment the temperature inside dipped. But then the materials around him began to warm again, responding to his body heat, trapping it, holding it. He pressed his hands against the inner layer and felt the familiar soft resistance of the fibers pushing back, creating small pockets of insulated air. He lay completely still, letting the structure do its work. Outside, the cold intensified by the minute. The frozen ground radiated an invisible chill that could kill an unprotected cadet in less than an hour. Rowan listened to the shifting frost as it settled over leaves and roots, producing delicate cracking sounds like thin ice breaking beneath a slow-moving river. Somewhere close by, he heard the short, rapid breathing of another cadet struggling against the temperature. A muffled whimper cut through the night, followed by frantic scraping as someone attempted to burrow deeper into a makeshift nest. He could not see who it was, but the sound of desperation was unmistakable. Inside the cocoon, Rowan felt the first wave of true warmth spread across his chest. It began slowly, a faint glow of comfort that radiated outward from his core. The insulation created small chambers where heat collected and lingered, drifting upward and wrapping around his legs, back, and shoulders. The sensation reminded him of lying under thick mountain blankets during winter hikes, when he had burrowed into his sleeping bag while snowstorms raged outside. He had no sleeping bag now, yet the feeling was surprisingly similar. He tested the airflow by exhaling into the crescent opening. The warm breath hit the edge of the cloth, spread slightly, and then dissipated before moisture could build. Good. He had balanced the ventilation correctly. Too much airflow, and the cold would bleed inside. Too little, and condensation would form and freeze. His breath formed faint mist, then faded instantly into the darkness. Minutes stretched into longer intervals, each one marked by the slow, steady rise in the cocoon's internal temperature. Rowan's body heat had nowhere else to go but into the insulation layers, which held it in place like a protective aura. He shifted very slightly, testing how the structure reacted to movement. The seams held firm. None of the materials shifted. The cocoon was functioning exactly as he intended. Beyond the roots, the forest began reacting to the freeze. Branches contracted with sharp pops. Frost swarmed across the leaves in a thin crystalline sheet, and small shards of ice drifted through the air like powdered glass. Rowan heard another cadet gasp as the cold overcame whatever shelter he had attempted. A distant scramble followed as someone abandoned an ineffective grass pile and tried to rebuild it before losing more heat. Rowan knew that panic would only worsen the situation. Once cold seeped into the core of the body, regaining warmth became nearly impossible without proper insulation. The wind shifted again, forcing a blast of icy air under the roots. Rowan felt the pressure of the cold against the cocoon, but only faintly, like a soft tap rather than a penetrating strike. The materials absorbed the impact, each layer dulling the force before it reached him. The sensation reminded him of watching waves crash against a rocky cliff. The energy dispersed harmlessly along the stone. His cocoon was the cliff now, and the cold was the wave. As time passed, Rowan grew warmer, not colder. The cocoon embraced him more tightly as the materials settled into their final arrangement. The warmth did not surge in sudden bursts, but deepened gradually, building a stable environment that kept his fingers and toes comfortable. He tested his grip strength, curling his hands into fists. No numbness, no stiffness. His toes flexed easily. He knew these were the signs of successful insulation. While lying still, he listened carefully to the forest. He had always believed that survival required not just action, but awareness, a constant reading of the environment. The sharp breaths and shivering of other cadets came at irregular intervals, now more frantic than before. Some had dug shallow pits, and when those failed, desperation pushed them to huddle together. He could hear one alien cadet shuffling closer to another, trying to share heat despite incompatible physiology. Rowan understood the instinct, but without proper insulation, shared suffering rarely translated to shared warmth. An hour passed. Then another. Rowan lost track of precise time, but he knew enough from the sensation in his body that the worst of the temperature drop had already begun. The night reached its coldest point near the middle, when the moons aligned in such a way that the light reflecting through the clouds barely touched the ground. He listened for signs of frostbite, for trembling breaths turning into slow, weakened rhythm on the cadet's side of the forest. But he forced himself to stay inside his cocoon. He could not help anyone while exposing himself. The cold was unforgiving. Even a minute without protection would undo hours of survival effort. Eventually, something shifted among the other cadets. There was a moment of pure silence, followed by footsteps, unsteady, dragging footsteps, approaching the roots. Rowan kept still, unsure who had wandered close. Then a voice, weak and trembling, whispered his name. A female cadet from the avian species he had observed earlier stood just outside the roots, shivering so violently that her voice broke between syllables. She begged him quietly to teach her whatever method he had used. Her feathers, fluffed earlier to trap warmth, had frozen at the edges. Even through his exhaustion and the instinct to remain sealed inside the cocoon, Rowan felt a steady determination rising within him. If he survived the night, and by now he was certain he would help her and anyone else who sought him out. He had created something that could save more than himself. But not yet. Not while the cold dominated the forest. He whispered through the opening, telling her to find a hollow between two roots nearby and stay there. He promised he would help her as soon as dawn gave them a chance. The avian cadet obeyed, curling into the hollow with what little strength she had left. Rowan tightened the drawstring again and settled deeper into the cocoon. The night raged on, but he no longer felt threatened. He felt warm, protected, and fully aware that he had built not just a shelter, but an invention shaped by instinct and necessity. The cold could push, scream, and claw, but it could no longer reach him. Rowan felt the temperature rise long before he saw the first hint of dawn. Inside the cocoon, the shift came as a soft loosening of the material around him. The moss and fibers no longer clung so tightly to his skin, as if the forest itself had finally exhaled. Outside, faint sounds of thawing drifted through the roots, ice splitting, leaves relaxing, small stones cracking apart as frost retreated. He waited a few more minutes, not because he needed the warmth, but because he needed to be sure the cadets around him had reached the same threshold of safety. Only then did he loosen the drawstring enough to pull himself upward. The air outside carried a biting chill, but compared to the brutal cold of the night, it felt survivable. Rowan stepped out of the cocoon, his breath fogging lightly as he straightened his back. His joints responded without stiffness, his hands steady, his feet warm. The cocoon had done its job so well that stepping into the morning cold felt almost refreshing. He folded part of the structure back to let the interior air out, then stood for a moment, studying the forest floor now coated in a delicate frost that glittered under the pale dawn light. A soft sound to his right drew his attention. The avian cadet he had guided to shelter the night before lay curled at the base of a thick root, trembling faintly but awake. Her feathers, once frozen stiff, now drooped with exhaustion rather than frost. Her eyes lifted toward Rowan, and even though she could barely speak, relief flooded her expression. He moved to her side, kneeling carefully to avoid startling her. When he placed his hand on her shoulder, she did not flinch. Instead, she leaned into the touch like someone anchoring herself to the last piece of warmth available. He checked her hands first. Her species relied heavily on circulation in the fingers for temperature regulation. Her palms felt cold, but not frozen. She would recover. He moved her gently into a seated position, then wrapped one of the loose cloth sections around her chest to help retain whatever heat remained. She whispered a thank you, barely audible, but Rowan heard every bit of sincerity in that fragile sound. As the light brightened, other cadets emerged from their makeshift shelters. Some crawled out slowly, shivering miserably. Others struggled to stand, weakened by the long night of insufficient insulation. A few had managed to sleep in short bursts, but most had passed the hours clinging desperately to consciousness to avoid slipping into deeper cold. Rowan looked from one cadet to the next, assessing their condition with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to harsh environments. Every one of them bore signs of the night's brutality. He rose, supporting the avian cadet until she could stand on her own, then scanned the clearing for materials. He had enough time before the instructor's arrival to help at least a few others. He gathered additional leaves, moss, and fibers, then sat beside a tall insectoid cadet whose mandibles clicked weakly as he spoke. Rowan listened to the cadet's stuttering explanation of how his grass pile had collapsed under the weight of frost. Rowan did not criticize him. He simply took the cadet's emergency cloth, opened it fully, and demonstrated how to create the layered pockets. The cadet watched with wide eyes, his breath trembling in his throat, and imitated Rowan's movements with shaking hands. Before long, two other cadets approached. an amphibian youth who had spent the night half buried under mud, and a feline cadet whose fur still crackled with ice. Both stood in front of Rowan silently, not asking questions but hoping he would choose to teach them as well. Rowan nodded once, a gesture that carried more reassurance than words. He helped them create smaller versions of his cocoon, each tailored to their physiology. For the amphibian cadet, he added thicker leaf layers to avoid moisture transfer. For the feline cadet, he emphasized breathability to prevent condensation in the fur. The more cadets gathered around him, the more Rowan felt a strange, steady responsibility settle on his shoulders. He did not feel pressured or overwhelmed. Instead, he felt certain that this had been the purpose of his survival, not just to endure the night alone, but to give others the means to endure as well. The cocoon had saved him, but now it was becoming something larger, something communal, something that belonged to anyone willing to learn from it. As he worked, distant footsteps echoed through the clearing. The instructors approached. Rowan did not stop what he was doing. He kept stitching the seam he was currently working on, his fingers moving with calm precision. The cadets around him fell silent, forming a loose semicircle as the reptilian instructor from earlier stepped into view. Frost glistened along the instructor's scales, yet his posture remained rigid, his expression unreadable. The instructor surveyed the clearing slowly. His gaze passed over cadets still shivering from the night, over collapsed nests of leaves, over failed attempts at insulation. Then his eyes reached Rowan and the cocoon lying open beside him, its interior still visibly warm despite the morning chill. The instructor's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in an almost imperceptible flicker of surprise. Rowan continued working without waiting for acknowledgement. He finished the seam and tied off the thread, then handed the cocoon to the insectoid cadet beside him. When he finally looked up, the instructor stood only a few steps away. The instructor lifted the corner of Rowan's cocoon, examining the stitching, the layered materials, the thoughtful distribution of insulation. He did not touch the interior. He did not need to. The structure spoke for itself. Rowan could tell the instructor understood exactly what he had built and how effective it must have been. "What is this?" the instructor asked, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "And how did you design it?" Rowan explained without embellishment. He described the materials he had gathered, the thermal principles he had combined, the airflow balance, the layered construction. He spoke clearly, focusing on the function rather than impressing anyone. As he talked, the other cadets listened with reverence. Their aching bodies were the strongest proof of the contrast between Rowan's innovation and their own failed attempts. The instructor remained silent for several seconds after Rowan finished. Then he nodded slowly, a gesture that carried weight and authority. "Your method," he said, "has surpassed the typical expectations of this trial, not only in execution, but in adaptability. You found a solution that aligns with the rules while enhancing survival far beyond standard means." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some cadets straightened, pride swelling at having learned from Rowan. Others stared at him with admiration, recognizing that his calm approach had turned a deadly night into a manageable challenge. The instructor shifted his gaze across the clearing before returning to Rowan. "This design will be documented," he announced. "Future cadets will train with the principles you discovered. Your cocoon will serve as the prototype for a new field technique." The words carried the unmistakable weight of official recognition. Rowan nodded respectfully, though he felt no surge of triumph. Instead, he felt a quiet satisfaction, a grounded certainty that came not from praise, but from usefulness. His invention had meaning beyond himself. It had saved others. It would continue saving others long after this trial ended. The instructor dismissed the cadets, granting them time to recover and gather strength before the next challenge. Some approached Rowan to thank him personally. The avian cadet bowed her head low, her voice still weak, but infused with deep gratitude. The insectoid cadet lifted his newly stitched cocoon with pride. The feline cadet gave Rowan a quiet nod, her tail curling once in acknowledgement. Rowan gathered his cocoon, inspecting it with a faint smile. It was no longer a desperate improvisation. It was a proven design, shaped by instinct, knowledge, and necessity. He folded it neatly and slung it over his shoulder. The day had only begun, but he felt ready for whatever came next. As he walked toward the training grounds, the forest cracked and shimmered behind him, thawing under the rising sun. The night had tested him, pressed him, pushed him to think differently. But in the end, he had not just endured it, he had transformed it into something new. And because of that, the instructors would never look at a simple emergency cloth the same way again.